So we heard a story about a boy named Samuel, but I want to start by telling you a little bit more about this kid. In a lot of ways, Samuel was a typical young boy. I'm sure he liked to play outside. He was probably rambunctious. He was probably reluctant to come in and do his chores when his mother called him, and he probably had to be reminded to take a shower. But at the same time, Samuel was not just a typical young boy like others, and this started with his mother. Samuel's mother was named Hannah, and for many, many years, Hannah desperately wanted to have a child. She longed to be a mother. She wanted a child to love, to nurture, and to raise. Yet, no matter how much Hannah longed to have a child, she was unable to. And being unable to have a child was no light matter. For this was seen as a sign that Hannah had not found favor in God's eyes. Nowadays, we have many scientific ways of explaining why people are unable to have children. But as far as Hannah, her husband, and the community were concerned, Hannah was unable to have children because God had decided not to bless her. Even Hannah's husband treated her poorly because she was unable to have kids. He would only give her a small portion of meat because she clearly wasn't blessed by God. And for a long while, Hannah was upset. And she waited, and she waited, and she waited for a child. At one point, she decided to make this long journey up to the temple. And when she finally, after a long day of walking, she made it there, and she fell at the steps of the entrance of the temple, and she cried, and she cried, and she cried out in anger to God and in bitterness and said, "What have I done to deserve this?" And so there at the altar, she pleaded with God to give her a son. And she promised God that if God were to give her a son, she would offer him back to be a servant in the house of God. As time passed by, Hannah shook with worry and doubt and wondered, would God bless her? Would God hear her? So I can only imagine the delight when Hannah realized she was pregnant with her first son, whom she named Samuel. And Hannah remained true to her promise. When Samuel was probably 5 or 6 years old, she took him to the temple and left him there to be a servant under the priest whose name was Eli. For Samuel, this meant he would help with the upkeep of the temple. He would assist the priest with what was ever needed, and he would help guard the Ark of the Covenant. I bet Samuel was excited and also nervous, and I'm sure quite confused, because this wasn't really his whole idea. He was just sort of born into this situation. And I mean, it's a huge honor to be a servant at the temple, but he was only a young boy and having to leave his family, and from that point on, Eli the priest was going to look after him. Eli was growing old, and I sort of imagine Samuel being like an apprentice to him. And now I know this is kind of a foreign concept to us, taking a child and leaving them at the church to live with the priest. And I know some of you are like, we can do that? But times were different then. We have here on Main Street, 4 churches just here on Main Street in Highlands? In Israel, there was one church, one temple that everyone came to. It was maybe like a monastery where people dedicated their lives to living there and taking care of it. And it was a pretty big deal. People from far away would make yearly pilgrimages all the way there to worship and present their offerings. Because at the temple, this was where the Ark of the Covenant was. And by that, I mean it was this big chest that had been made during the time of Moses, and it was where God had promised to live while here on earth. This was the most holy and sacred place there was, and people would travel for days just to be near the presence of God. And you weren't even allowed to be in the same room as the Ark of the Covenant, because if you saw God in person, they thought you wouldn't live. That is how holy and sacred this place was. And so they had the Holy of Holies, and then outside the next room was another place called the Holy Place. And this is where the priests would go and make sacrifices and pray on behalf of the people. And then outside of this, even further, was the altar. And someone was there at all times to keep watch. At night, a lamp remained lit in the sanctuary because even though people were sleeping and it was dark, the light reminded everyone that God's presence was still there. And so one particular night, it was Samuel's turn to be on guard and sleep close by the entrance to make sure everything was taken care of. And so one night, it was early in the morning, maybe around 3 a.m., still several hours before the sun would begin to rise. It was one of those mornings where everything was still. Even the chickens and the wild animals that roamed freely had laid down to rest. And suddenly Samuel heard a voice calling his name, and he jumped up and he went running to where Eli was sleeping. He flung open the door and he said, "Here I am, for you called me." Eli, who was woken abruptly, said, "I didn't call for you. Go back and lay down." Samuel was a little confused. Either he was hearing things or someone else was there. But usually it was Eli that would call him for stuff, so he was confused, and Samuel did what Eli told him to do, and he went and he laid back down. He had trouble going back to sleep, and I bet he flinched with every rustling of the leaves. And just as he was drifting off to sleep once again, Samuel hears God calling his name, and he jumps up, and with his heart beating out of his chest, he runs to Eli. "Here I am. What do you need, sir?" Only to find out once again that it wasn't Eli who called him. And after the third time of this happening, Eli said, "Samuel, I think God may be trying to tell you something. Next time you hear your name, instead of running off to find out who needs you, why don't you stay still and listen?" Here Samuel was laying on the steps of the most holy places in all of Israel, and he didn't recognize God's voice. Maybe Samuel is like us and hadn't considered that God would actually talk to him personally. Maybe Samuel was too busy with all the work of the church that he never took time to listen. Maybe the upkeep of the church facility was more important to him than listening to God. Or maybe Samuel came to want his pastor more than God. Maybe Samuel was worshiping and serving Eli, and that's why he didn't recognize God's voice. See, there are many voices competing for our attention. And how many of us can say that we really know God well enough to recognize a word as being from God or from someone else? Some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but several years ago I spent some time over in Tanzania, and I was working with United Methodist Volunteer and Mission, and I was placed at this Methodist orphanage and secondary school in Tanzania as a missionary. And so that time that I went, I left in January, and I had everything lined up to begin physician's assistant school when I returned. And in the meantime, I was thoroughly enjoying myself in Tanzania, working at the orphanage, the school. I had a variety of responsibilities, one of which was taking the sick kids to the hospital and being with them, and I also helped with administrative tasks at the secondary school. But needless to say, every day was different, and things rarely went as planned. And I learned very quickly that productivity was going to look very differently for me there than I was used to. Many evenings, the electricity would go out, and I found myself going to bed with the sun and waking up bright and early. Life was slower there. Tasks were secondary to relationships, which was why going to the post office could literally take all day. Because if you passed by a friend's store, you must stop, sit down, talk. And eventually, I too began to slow down. Saturdays and Sundays, the kids and I would take a long walk down to the river where they would go swimming. Or if a huge rainstorm came and everything shut down, we would just all pile into bed and take a nap, or the girls would braid my hair. But the longer I was there, the less Sure, I became about all my plans. I was so frustrated with myself and with God, and for so long I'd been praying to God to help me decide what to do. I kept going back and forth, and I was full of all this uncertainty. And at this point, I had 2 weeks before I had to submit my deposit to school to hold my spot. And so I decided that for the next 2 weeks, I was going to pray every day about this decision. And because for the first time, I think probably in my life, I had more space than I'd ever remember having. I had long walks to the post office, long rides on the back of motorcycle taxis, waiting for people to come for meetings that didn't show up till the next day. And I prayed over and over again. And one day, I was riding on the back of a motorcycle taxi out to the orphanage, which is about a 10 to 15 minute drive. And the sun was beaming down, and the breeze, though, of the motorcycle felt like air conditioning. And we're zooming along on these dirt roads in the countryside, and I look out into the distance, and I said to God, I don't know what to do. Please give me direction. And immediately the words that came to my mind were, are you really ready to listen? And I was like, you're calling my bluff. Maybe no, I'm not ready to listen. And it was pretty humbling to realize that I wasn't actually willing to listen, that I wanted God to affirm my plans. And at that point, my prayers changed, and I began to pray for courage to listen. It was one of those moments that I felt God talking to me, and it changed me. For so long, I had wanted God to appear like a billboard flashing on the side of the road as I zoomed past, just tell me what to do. Or I wanted other people to tell me what God was saying. And well, if you came this morning thinking I was going to give you the 10-step approach to know if God's talking to you or not, you're going to be disappointed. Because the truth is, I can't tell you how to know. But I can tell you the story of Samuel. And I can tell you that God is patient and persistent. That God continued to call Samuel even when he continued to not recognize the voice. So even if you haven't been listening, God hasn't given up. I can't tell you who's calling, but I can tell you that the words from God are a rare gift. In verse 1 that we read in Samuel, it says, the word of the Lord was rare, as in it was precious, something to be treasured. It didn't come in the middle of all the hustle and bustle of the day. It came in the very wee hours of the morning when everything was still and quiet, when only a few lights were burning and most people were sleeping. I can't tell you who's calling, but I do think we must create space, and we must be still and listen, and we must be patient. And I can't tell you for sure who's calling, but I can say that God's words are often recognized in community. Sometimes we need others to help us recognize God's voice. After all, it was Eli who helped Samuel learn to listen and wonder if God was calling. Because the truth is, there's a lot I don't know about recognizing God's voice. It's rare. But what I do know is that we have a God who does call us by name. And so read about those stories where God is speaking to people in Scripture. And ask those people around you how they have heard God speak to them. And most of all, be ready to listen. Because when God does speak, it will change you. Amen.